We're here in my backyard. I'm going to cover some material here for us to cover some history here. What was going on when Thomas Jefferson was president? What was going on when James Madison and so forth was president here? And this is the textbook that you would have had hard copy had we had been in person. But chapter 8, and it's not going to match up perfectly to the Yelp one, the online one. But basically, guys, look. Thomas Jefferson wins the 1800 election. People call it like this peaceful revolution of 1800. A lot of people in Europe said, look, the Federalists control the White House, the Senate, the House of Representatives. Now Jefferson's party, the Jeffersonian Republicans, the Democratic Republicans have won all three, control of all three. There's going to be a civil war. Look, democracy is going to fail, etc. And the fact of the matter is there's this peaceful transition. A little bit of shenanigans with the midnight justices that we had already talked about before. But you have a peaceful transition. There is no violence. There is no blood. The Federalists don't try to hang on to power by force. And so the fact of the matter is, at this time, America as a whole only has about 7.25 million people in the entire country. That's by 1810 census. And so that's kind of like just after Jefferson had been president. But you can see that there's not really a lot of people by today's standards. Michigan alone has about 10 million people today. And the country today has about 330 million or a little bit over 330 million today. And so you can see the population was significantly smaller just 200 years ago. It's dramatically grown from a little bit over 7 million to well over 330 million over the past 200 years. But Thomas Jefferson, he's probably most famous for this Louisiana Purchase. He had been trying to buy a little piece of land so that we would have full access to the Mississippi River. Because although we owned out to the Mississippi River as our western border back then, the fact of the matter is the Gulf Coast there was part of Spanish Florida, and then you had kind of like France, then Spain, then back to France controlling like the Louisiana area. So to make a long story short, Jefferson asks to buy a small piece of land so he could always have that. What would be, I guess, the eastern bank of the Mississippi River, and so we'd always have access to the river. And to make a long story short, he's shocked when Napoleon of France offers him the whole entire Louisiana territory for a great deal. He needs the money. He's trying to, he's fighting pretty much half of Europe at the time. And so Napoleon just wants the money. He doesn't care if he loses it. And what he's doing here is arguably unconstitutional, what Jefferson's doing. Nowhere does it say the president can just go off and try to offer to buy land. Because remember, Jefferson had been like the strict constructionist. You read the Constitution very strictly. You can only do it if it expressly says you can do it. None of this loose constructionist stuff. The Federalists had been arguing to expand the government's powers. And, but he kind of goes ahead and does it anyways, arguing that there's implied powers, which basically is a win for what the Federalists had been arguing about. There's lots of powers that aren't expressly written in the Constitution given to the government. But to make a long story short, he gets Louisiana territory purchased. Lewis and Clark expedition is sent to the Pacific. They want to find a water route passage all the way to the Pacific. There is none. You got the Continental Divide where the Rocky Mountains are, so you can't take a boat straight through. But they take off from St. Louis to get as far as they can, up rivers, and then they get out on foot and so forth. But they do make it to the Pacific and back, and Sacagawea becomes famous today from this. But they're told by Jefferson to have, be peaceful and kind to the Native Americans on their way out there, try to create trade relationships with them, and so forth. Kids, cats. All right. And so that's what you have here. All right. And this Louisiana Territory arguably does some damage to the country. How so? This expansion of slavery westward. We have all this land, the Louisiana Territory. Remember, the Louisiana Territory back then, it's not just modern-day Louisiana. It's like modern-day Louisiana all the way up to, actually into, technically, a little bit of modern-day Canada. It comprises several states that are just west of the Mississippi River today. And at first, they'd even talked about this would always be some Native American preserve. But then they quickly start talking about we need to expand into it, we need to move into it. And what's kind of funny is a lot of people at the time talked about how, we will never fill up this land, not even within 1,000 years. Well, here we are 2 centuries later. And, most of that land's used somehow as farmland or, for housing, and there's still parks and nature land. But obviously that prediction was way, way off. People couldn't foresee just how much the population would grow. But as we get all this new land out there, we start to fight. Will this new land become slave states, or will it become free states? And you're going to see fighting over this land. And you have, like the 1820, the Missouri Compromise tries to settle this question in the Louisiana Territory. But then it springs back up again with Kansas and Nebraska, the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And so you see this common theme here with the Louisiana Territory, again with other things such as the Mexican-American War. We get land out west, and then what happens to the country? The country gets into heated arguments about whether this new land taken, in this case bought from Napoleon, but a lot of those Native Americans there might be saying, well, Napoleon had no right to sell it to you. But the fact of the matter is, we get all this new land, and then the North and South get into heated debates about whether that land will be turned into free states or slave states. And the fact of the matter is, not all Northerners are arguing it should be free states based on morality. A lot of them are arguing it based on economic reasons, saying that, look, us poor middle class white men shouldn't have to compete against rich slave owners who can move out there, buy all the best farmland, and then do what? Have hundreds or even thousands of slaves working it. And it's not fair to us middle class farmers who would have to compete against that. The external slave trade is banned in 1808. Now, this just means no new slaves from Africa. Slavery is still legal in America. This doesn't free any slaves. It's just no new slaves can come in legally. Now, some still come in illegally, but even the slave owners overwhelmingly supported this. And you might wonder, why is that? It's simple economics. And I hate to say that when you're talking about slavery. You're talking about human beings, but it's simple economics. They view their slaves as property, human property. And you guys all know basic economics. If you oversupply something, the prices for it drop. And so even a lot of slave owners were like, well, my wealth is in large part my slaves. And so if we keep bringing in more and more and more slaves, my wealth is actually going down. And I don't want my wealth to go down. And so the fact of the matter is, a lot of slave owners wanted this. A lot of southern whites who didn't own slaves also wanted this, in the sense that they were kind of worried, hey, some of those areas in the South, some of the counties have more slaves than citizens, more black people than white people. And a lot of even non-slave owners in the South were basically like, hey, we don't want more and more and more and more slaves, especially as you start to see rebellions. I mean, remember like Prosper's rebellion and then the Haitian Revolution. And you look at all of those things, and it makes a lot of people worried about bringing in more and more slaves. The Embargo Act of 1807 that Jefferson puts into place hurts the U.S. economy. This guy who's always talking about liberty arguably puts in the police state to enforce this. Basically, to make a long story short, both France and Britain were stopping our boats, stealing cargo, violating our neutral rights in the high seas. Why were they doing that? Well, the fact of the matter is Britain and France were constantly at war, and because they both thought that we should take their side, and because we were trying to be neutral, then they would stop boats that were maybe headed towards France if you were the British and steal the cargo. If they thought it was headed towards Britain, maybe the French would stop the boat and steal the cargo. And eventually this gets repealed because it basically says, we can't export to the rest of the world certain things, and it just destroys the American economy. This cat is like a hunter out here. It goes for anything out here in the woods. All right. Jefferson reduces the size of the military. The Barbary War. There had been these pirates off the coast of North Africa, like modern-day Tunisia area, and Tripoli. And the fact of the matter is, Europe had been trying to put a stop to this for a long time, and really wasn't able to do a good job. And America travels across the ocean and puts up a fight against these Barbary pirates, and actually does a pretty good job. And a lot of Europeans are shocked and see America as having arrived on some sort of a world stage. We're kind of still seen as a second-class power, but a lot stronger than what a lot of Europeans had seen us before, when our Navy is able to travel across the ocean into Europe's backyard. The Mediterranean Sea kind of touches Europe there to the north and Africa to the south. So you got these North African pirates in the Mediterranean Sea, and then they dip out into the Atlantic Ocean. But America's traveling across the ocean and kind of putting a stop to a lot of this pirate shenanigans going on. James Madison's the next president. He and Jefferson are like-minded on a lot of issues. They're both subscribed to the same political party, although Madison had been the father of the Constitution that wanted it ratified, whereas Jefferson was more hesitant until they got the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments. But Madison kind of comes up. He's still trying to deal with this Britain and France stopping and stealing our cargo. They're the Embargo Act. And so Madison basically says, we'll trade with everyone but France and Britain until they behave. And that doesn't really work very well. Britain and France are two of the biggest economies. Then they come up with Macon's Bill number 2. We'll trade with only France or Britain, depending on which one respects our neutral shipping rights first. France jumps on the offer right away, but then they start violating it again, and it just goes to crap. The Battle of Tippecanoe happens when Madison's president. This is actually in modern-day Indiana. I once took kids on a school field trip to see Purdue University's campus to get like a tour a long time ago. And on the way there, we passed a sign for the Battle of Tippecanoe for where to pull off on the highway. William Henry Harrison becomes a national hero when he defeats Tecumseh's men here in Indiana. He's later going to play off this and become president off this fame. Back then, you see a lot of generals become president. It was kind of natural for a general who had won some great victory or some great war to be able to catapult themselves up. People like Washington, William Henry Harrison, Andrew Jackson, a lot of these people. Taylor from the Mexican-American War. But anyways, Tecumseh, he was this Native American leader, and he's going to end up dying in the War of 1812. But the fact of the matter is, he says, look, us Native Americans need to unify together. Hold on to your land. Stop moving west. Stop getting pushed west. He also says no alcohol consumption. Most Native Americans weren't used to alcohol, and they hadn't had centuries of drinking alcohol like the Europeans had. And so alcohol was affecting the Native Americans differently than the Europeans. And the fact of the matter is, you have high rates of alcoholism that Tecumseh notices, and he says no alcohol. Do not trade for alcohol. Do not drink for alcohol. No alcohol. And Tecumseh also notices that a lot of the Europeans would get the Native Americans liquored up, you might say, before doing like trade deals, and then they could get, or peace treaties and things like that, or selling of land to get better terms. And he says, avoid contact with whites and don't trade with whites. He says, generally speaking, he doesn't mind getting guns and things like that, but he says that Native Americans are becoming too dependent upon Europeans for certain tools, metal tools and tools to make fires and so forth, and we need to rely on ourselves. And that, he says, too often tribes fight other tribes. Why are tribes fighting other tribes when all tribes are getting pushed backwards by the white population? So tribes need to stop fighting amongst themselves, unify to resist this westward encroachment by white settlers out into the frontier, pushing us back westward. So he's like a unifying. He's a Shawnee, but he gets all these other tribes, including like the Potawatomi, who had people who had been in our West Michigan area here. But War of 1812 against Britain. What are the causes? So the causes are basically, the biggest cause is Britain had been stopping our boats, stealing our cargo. And as they stop our boats and steal our cargo, sometimes they do what's called impressment. They impress. They take people that they suspect to have been British subjects off of the boats and force them to serve in the Royal Navy. And they do this to thousands of people. And remember, it's a much smaller population back then. So this is a significant number. You see some numbers saying they did it to up to potentially 8,000 even people off American boats. It's outrageous. It's not just kidnapping, but they're forcing them to serve in the Royal Navy, fighting against Napoleon's Navy. You know, you're just in some commercial boat trying to sell. We got some leaves falling. That's pretty cool. Trying to be part of commerce, peacefully trade, and the next thing you know, Britain's forcing you to fight in a war that's not your war. So this impressment is greatly outrageous. Now, some of the people had been born in England and kind of deserted because they didn't want to fight the Napoleonic Wars and got on U.S. boats. But many of them were Americans. And a lot of the sailors would get like very American tattoos to try to prove their American status. And here's another big one besides the impressment. Now, Britain is giving guns, or trading guns might be a better way of saying it, to Native Americans out west. And Michigan is actually one of the areas that the guns are flowing in through Detroit and places like Sault Ste. Marie, where it touches British Canada. And so the fact of the matter is, guns are flowing to Native Americans. And now, yes, whites are attacking Native American villages and whites are wiping out the entire village and so forth. But the fact of the matter is, the average American either doesn't see that or feels it's justified, and Native Americans are using these British guns to attack and wipe out entire villages of white settlers, American villages moving westward. And yeah, those Native Americans are fighting for their very existence, they're fighting for their culture, but the average American, 200 some years ago, they don't see it that way. They see it as Britain has blood on their hands. They're giving these Native Americans guns. These guns are killing Americans. These guns are wiping out our entire villages in some cases. The Warhawks, these are young senators who are just pushing for war. Henry Clay out of Kentucky. John C. Calhoun out of South Carolina. Most support for war is down south and out west. There's support for the war in the Northeast, but mostly against it, at least initially. Most of the people in the Northeast, they're like, we want to trade with Britain. We don't want to fight Britain. Or it's going to be very disruptive to our commerce. And even not just with Britain, but if we're at war with Britain, they're going to be stopping our boats heading for any country. And we just want to make money. We want to live in peace. In the Northeast, where the Federalists have their strong base of support, they have this Hartford Convention in Hartford, Connecticut. And they blast the war. They propose massive changes to the Constitution. Like all states have to vote in favor of war to go to war. Another amendment they propose is that the current president, the next president can't come from the same state as the current president. And so they're seen as disloyal against the country. A lot of the people see these Federalists as it's very, very controversial. And then Andrew Jackson wins the Battle of New Orleans. And the fact of the matter is he becomes this national hero. It's going to catapult him to the presidency in the future. And all of a sudden, America kind of goes from being mixed on the War of 1812 to heavily in favor of it. And here you just have all of these Federalists sharply criticizing the war, demanding constitutional changes, and they're seen as unpatriotic. And the Federalist Party starts to die off. Remember, if you're a Federalist fan, don't worry. A lot of their ideas come back in the form of a new party called the Whigs. And the Whigs are named after a party in Britain. And the party in Britain called the Whigs, they oppose monarchy or absolute monarchy rule. They want more of a constitution. They want more rule for Parliament. You could argue like a little bit more democracy in Britain. And so the Whigs named themselves after that British party in large part because they're saying Andrew Jackson is a king. He acts like a tyrant. We're like the Whigs in Britain who oppose tyranny. Boom, boom, boom. That's what we're doing here. You probably don't need to know all the specifics of the Yazoo River controversy. But to make a long story short, some people are essentially swindled out of land. The state passes a law. They're going to get the land back that these corrupt politicians had sold to them. And it goes to Fletcher v. Peck. And Fletcher v. Peck is important because it's the first U.S. Supreme Court decision that overturns a state law. And so John Marshall, who had done the what's that cat doing? Just something. So who had done the I thought the cat was about to try to pounce on something. So John Marshall, who had basically created judicial review for the national government with Marbury v. Madison 1803, basically here with Fletcher v. Peck says we also have judicial review over state laws, not just national laws like we did in Marbury v. Madison 1803. And so Georgia cannot take away land from innocent buyers in a government fraud case. But guys, that's the end of chapter 8 here, kind of talking about Jefferson and Madison. Stay positive. Send me emails, stuff like that if you have questions. But guys, have a good day. Enjoy the fall colors. They're starting to really come out now, and at least some of the trees. But all right, take care.